The day the Republic died. The sun rose blood red over the Ionian Sea on the second day of September, 31 years before the birth of Christ. If you had been standing on the shores of Actium that morning, you would have seen something that hadn't been witnessed in human history for centuries. 2 Roman fleets, each carrying the future of the known world in their hulls, preparing to annihilate each other. But this wasn't just another battle. This was the death rattle of the Roman Republic, gasping its final breaths before transforming into something altogether different, altogether more terrible and magnificent. And you need to understand something crucial right now. Everything you know about Western civilization, every structure of power that followed, every emperor, every king, every concept of imperial might, it all traces back to what happened in those blood-soaked waters. Marcus Agrippa stood on the deck of his flagship, watching the eastern horizon where his enemy's vessels would soon appear. He was 32 years old, battle-hardened and utterly loyal to one man, Octavian, the heir of Julius Caesar. Agrippa's hands, scarred from 1,000 sword practices, gripped the wooden railing as the morning wind whipped his cloak. He had fought in Gaul, in Illyria, in countless theaters of war, but never had the stakes been this monumentally high. Across those waters, in the Bay of Actium, where the combined fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII of Egypt lay at anchor, another kind of morning was unfolding. Antony, once the golden warrior of Rome, the man who had stood beside Caesar and avenged his murder, paced the deck of his quinquereme like a caged lion. At 52, he should have been in his prime, but months of blockade, disease ravaging his troops, and the psychological warfare waged by Octavian had taken their toll. His face, once handsome enough to seduce half of Rome, now showed the deep lines of a man haunted by impossible choices. But here's what makes this moment pierce through the centuries and grab you by the throat. Antony wasn't alone in his desperation. Below deck, in quarters befitting a pharaoh, Cleopatra VII prepared for battle. Think about this for a moment. Here was a woman who had already outlasted countless assassination attempts, who had borne children to Julius Caesar himself, who ruled the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, now reduced to this, gambling everything on a naval battle in foreign waters. She was 39 years old, and she understood something that Antony, for all his military genius, had failed to grasp. They had already lost. The question wasn't whether they would win this battle, but whether they would survive it. How did it come to this? How did Rome, the republic that had conquered the known world, find itself tearing itself apart in these waters? You need to understand the chain of events that led to this moment, because it's a story about ambition, love, betrayal, and the terrible price of power. 13 years earlier, Julius Caesar had been assassinated on the Ides of March, stabbed 23 times by senators who claimed they were saving the Republic. They were fools. Caesar's death didn't save anything. It merely released the dogs of civil war once again. Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, had joined forces with Caesar's adopted heir, young Octavian and Marcus Lepidus, to hunt down the assassins. They formed the Second Triumvirate, 3 men who divided the Roman world among themselves and proceeded to purge their enemies in a bloodbath that would have made Robespierre proud. But triumvirates are inherently unstable. 3 is a crowd when you're trying to rule the world. Lepidus was pushed aside first, exiled to a comfortable retirement that was really just house arrest with better wine. That left 2, Antony and Octavian, the warrior and the calculation. The Roman world was split. Octavian took the west, Italy, Gaul, Hispania. Antony took the east, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and most critically, Egypt. And it was in Egypt that Antony's fate took its decisive turn, because Egypt meant Cleopatra. Now, you've probably heard the stories. Cleopatra, the seductress, who bewitched both Caesar and Antony with her exotic beauty. But strip away the Roman propaganda, and yes, almost everything written about her was propaganda, and you find something far more interesting. Cleopatra was brilliant. She spoke 9 languages. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to actually learn Egyptian.
She understood economics, military strategy, and the game of power better than almost anyone alive. When Antony arrived in Egypt, he didn't seduce her. She made a calculated decision to ally with him. She needed Roman military might to secure her throne and her kingdom. He needed her wealth to fund his campaigns. What began as political necessity became something else, something that both of them might have called love, though in the corridors of power, love and ambition often wear the same face. They married in 37 BCE, though Antony was already married to Octavia's sister, Octavia, a marriage designed to cement the alliance between the two triumvirs. This wasn't just scandal, it was political suicide. In Rome, Octavian's propaganda machine went into overdrive. Antony, they whispered, had been corrupted by Eastern decadence. He had abandoned Roman values for Egyptian luxury. He was planning to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria. He was going to make that foreign queen the Empress of Rome. Some of it was true. Some of it was exaggeration. All of it was useful to Octavian, who understood something that Antony never quite grasped. In politics, perception matters more than reality. The final break came in 32 BCE, when Octavian illegally seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins, a sacrilege that should have destroyed his career. But what the will allegedly contained was even more scandalous. Antony left Roman territories to Cleopatra's children and requested to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. Whether the will was genuine or forged, and smart money says Octavian doctored it, didn't matter. The Senate was outraged. War was declared, not against Antony, a fellow Roman, but against Cleopatra, the foreign queen. It was a clever trick. Octavian couldn't be seen as starting another civil war. Rome was exhausted by civil wars. But a war against a foreign power, that was different. That was patriotic. That was noble. The fact that defeating Cleopatra meant destroying Antony was just an unfortunate necessity. So now, on this morning in September, all those years of maneuvering, all that blood and treasure, all those broken promises and shattered alliances came down to this, a naval battle in the Ionian Sea. Antony's fleet numbered somewhere between 300 and 500 warships. The sources vary, but what's certain is that many of them were massive quinquerine and even larger vessels, some carrying towers and artillery. These were floating fortresses, crewed by soldiers more than sailors. Antony's strategy was simple: use his heavier ships to board and overwhelm Octavian's lighter vessels in close combat. It was a land battle transposed to water, which makes sense. Antony was fundamentally a land commander. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa's command, numbered about 400 ships, but they were smaller, faster Liburnians, biremes and triremes that could outmaneuver the lumbering giants of Antony's fleet. Agrippa had studied this battle for months, and he had a plan. As the fleets rowed towards each other, you could hear the drumbeat of the rowing masters echoing across the water, the creak of wood and rope, the prayers of men who knew they might be dead before sunset. On Antony's ships, his soldiers stood ready with their javelins and swords, prepared to leap onto enemy decks. On Octavian's vessels, the sailors checked their rigging and prepared for rapid maneuvers. But here's what makes this moment pierce through the centuries and grab you by the throat. Antony wasn't alone in his desperation. Below deck, in quarters befitting a pharaoh, Cleopatra VII prepared for battle. Think about this for a moment. Here was a woman who had already outlasted countless assassination attempts, who had borne children to Julius Caesar himself, who ruled the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, now reduced to this, gambling everything on a naval battle in foreign waters. She was 39 years old, and she understood something that Antony, for all his military genius, had failed to grasp. They had already lost. The question wasn't whether they would win this battle, but whether they would survive it. How did it come to this? How did Rome, the republic that had conquered the known world, find itself tearing itself apart in these waters? You need to understand the chain of events that led to this moment, because it's a story about ambition, love, betrayal, and the terrible price of power.
The battle began at noon with a slow, grinding clash of the center forces. Antony's heavy ships moved forward ponderously, and Agrippa's lighter vessels darted in and out, refusing to be trapped in the boarding actions that Antony wanted. For hours, the battle swayed back and forth with no decisive advantage to either side. Men screamed and died, ships burned, the sea turned red with blood. And then Cleopatra made her move. Her squadron of 60 Egyptian ships held in reserve behind the main battle line suddenly raised their purple sails, the sails that had been stowed during the fighting, and broke through a gap in the battle line. They were fleeing, running south toward Egypt, toward home. The shock must have been electric. Allied ships didn't flee while the battle was still undecided. But Cleopatra's vessels were cutting through the chaos and making for open water, carrying with them the war treasury, all the gold and wealth that was supposed to fund the campaign. And then, incredibly, Antony did the unthinkable. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship and chased after her, abandoning his fleet in the middle of the battle. Let that sink in for a moment. The supreme commander of the combined fleet abandoned his men while they were still fighting. He left them to die while he pursued Cleopatra's ships toward the horizon. What was he thinking? Was it love? Cowardice? A prearranged plan? This is the question that has haunted historians ever since. And I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. It was probably all three and none of them simultaneously. Here's what we know. The battle was already going badly for Antony. His heavy ships were being outmaneuvered, his crews were sick, disease had ravaged his forces during the months of blockade before the battle. His own captains had advised against fighting at sea at all, suggesting instead a retreat to land where Antony's legions might have better chances. But Cleopatra had insisted on a naval battle, perhaps because she wanted to preserve the option of escape if things went wrong. And things had gone wrong. By the time Cleopatra's ships broke through, both she and Antony must have realized that victory was impossible. The question was whether to die fighting in a lost cause or live to fight another day. Antony chose to follow Cleopatra, and in that choice, he doomed everything he had built. His remaining forces fought on for hours, not knowing their commander had abandoned them. Some ships surrendered, others fought to the death. Agrippa, showing the tactical brilliance that had won him Octavian's trust, didn't pursue Cleopatra and Antony immediately. He focused on destroying the remaining enemy fleet methodically, completely. By evening, it was over. Antony's fleet was destroyed, burned, or captured. Octavian had won the battle, but he had let his main prizes escape. It was a calculated decision. Let them run to Egypt. Let them stew in their defeat. Octavian would come for them in his own time. The following months unfolded with the terrible inevitability of Greek tragedy. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, where they tried to pretend that everything was fine, throwing lavish parties while their world crumbled around them. Antony's land forces, hearing of his betrayal at Actium, deserted en masse to Octavian. Cities that had supported them flipped their allegiance. The couple who had dreamed of ruling the world from Egypt found themselves isolated, surrounded, doomed. Octavian took his time pursuing them. He spent the winter consolidating his power, ensuring that no one back in Italy could challenge him while he was in the east. When he finally marched on Egypt in summer of 30 BCE, it was less an invasion than a funeral procession. Antony's remaining forces surrendered without significant fighting. The man who once commanded legions found himself with barely enough men to defend his palace. On August 1st, receiving false reports that Cleopatra was already dead, Antony stabbed himself with his sword. He botched it. Suicide is harder than it looks in the movies. Bleeding and in agony, he was carried to Cleopatra, who had barricaded herself in her tomb. He died in her arms, 53 years old, a broken shadow of the glorious warrior he had once been. Cleopatra held out for a few more days. She tried to negotiate with Octavian, offering him treasure, offering him Egypt, possibly even offering herself. But Octavian was Caesar's heir in more ways than blood. He was immune to her charms, interested only in the cold calculus of power. He planned to parade her through Rome in his triumph, the ultimate humiliation for a queen who had consorted with Romans as an equal. She chose to deny him that satisfaction. On August 12th, 39 years old, she arranged her suicide. The traditional story says she used an asp, an Egyptian cobra.
Modern historians think it was probably poison. What matters is that she died on her own terms, dressed in her royal regalia, having ordered her servants to bury her beside Antony. Octavian had her wish carried out. He might have been ruthless, but he wasn't completely devoid of respect for worthy adversaries. He also had Caesarion, Cleopatra's son with Julius Caesar, hunted down and killed. You don't leave potential rival claimants to power alive. That's empire building 101. Cleopatra's other children by Antony were spared and raised by Octavian's wife Livia. They disappeared into comfortable obscurity, which in the Roman world was a kind of mercy. Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, the land of the pharaohs that had stood independent for 3,000 years, became a Roman province. Not even a normal province. Octavian claimed it as his personal property. The wheat of Egypt, which had fed Cleopatra's dreams of empire, would now feed Rome and cement Octavian's power. And Octavian himself? He returned to Rome in triumph, literally. A triumph was the highest military honor Rome could bestow, a parade through the streets with captured enemies and looted treasure. In 27 BCE, he accepted the title Augustus, the revered one, and became the first Roman emperor, though he was clever enough never to call himself king. He ruled for 40 years, transforming Rome from a republic tearing itself apart into an empire that would dominate the Western world for centuries. The Battle of Actium accomplished what decades of civil war had failed to achieve. It concentrated all power in the hands of one man. The Republic, that grand experiment in shared governance and senatorial authority, was dead. Oh, the Senate still met, and Octavian carefully maintained the fiction of republican government, but everyone knew the truth. Rome had an emperor now, and it would have emperors until the very end. But here's what you need to understand about why this matters, why this battle that happened over 2,000 years ago still resonates. Actium was the template for how personal ambition, political propaganda, and military might combined to reshape the world. Octavian won not just because he had better ships or because Agrippa was a brilliant admiral, though both were true. He won because he understood narrative control. He turned a civil war between Romans into a righteous war against a foreign threat. He painted Antony not as a rival, but as a traitor, seduced by Eastern decadence. He made Cleopatra the villain of the story, the dangerous foreign woman corrupting Roman values. This propaganda survived for 2 millennia. Even now, when most people think of Cleopatra, they think of her as the seductress, not the brilliant politician. They think of her romance with Antony, not her earlier alliance with Caesar, or her skill at managing one of the ancient world's most complex economies.
The lesson here cuts deep. History is written by the winners, and the winners write it to justify their victory. Every empire that followed Rome learned this. Every dictator who wrapped himself in the flag while dismantling democratic institutions learned this. The playbook that Octavian used: demonize your opponents as threats to national values, concentrate power in the name of security and stability, maintain the appearance of traditional institutions while gutting their actual authority, has been repeated so many times throughout history that we should recognize it instantly. And yet we often don't, because the story is always packaged differently. It's always, this time is different, this leader is special, these threats are real. Sometimes the threats are real, sometimes the leader is special, but the end result is usually the same: less freedom, more concentrated power, and a new normal that previous generations would have found unthinkable. There's another lesson embedded in Actium, one about the relationship between love and power. Was Antony's relationship with Cleopatra his downfall, or was it just the excuse Octavian needed? Could Antony have defeated Octavian if he had stayed in Rome, kept his marriage to Octavia, played the political game instead of building an Eastern empire with an Egyptian queen? Maybe. But that wouldn't have been Antony. He was a man of passion and action, not calculation and patience. Cleopatra didn't destroy him. She was the partner he chose because she matched his own nature. Two people who believed they could defy the odds, reshape the world through will and ambition, only to discover that will and ambition aren't enough when your opponent controls the narrative.
Their story became the archetype for the doomed romance between power and passion, recycled in 1,000 variations through literature and history. Caesar and Cleopatra, Antony and Cleopatra. It's all there in Shakespeare, in Shaw, in countless retellings. But the real story is darker and more complex than romance. It's about two intelligent, capable people who made a calculated gamble and lost everything. Stand on the shores of Actium today, and you'll find a quiet stretch of Greek coastline. There is some ruins, some archaeological remains, a small museum. Nothing that hints at the world-shaking drama that unfolded here. The sea that ran red with blood is now blue and peaceful. The air that once rang with the screams of dying men now carries only the cry of gulls and the whisper of wind through olive trees. But if you close your eyes and let history wash over you, you can almost see them. Agrippa on his flagship, calculating and ruthless. Antony pacing his deck, torn between duty and survival. Cleopatra making the hardest choice of her life, raising those purple sails and running for home. And Octavian, miles away but present in every decision, every maneuver. The puppet master who would emerge from this chaos as the master of the world. The Battle of Actium didn't just end the Roman Republic, it ended an entire way of thinking about how society should be organized. For 500 years, Rome had proven that a republic could conquer the world. But in the end, that republic couldn't govern what it had conquered. It couldn't contain the ambitions of its own great men. It couldn't survive its own success. The empire that rose from Actium's waters would last another 500 years in the west, another 1,000 years in the east as Byzantium. It would give us roads and aqueducts, law and literature, the foundations of Western civilization. It would also give us tyranny and slavery, conquest and oppression. Like all empires, it was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. When Augustus died in 14 CE, 44 years after Actium, his last words were reportedly, "Have I played the part well?" It was an actor's line, fitting for a man who had spent his life crafting an image. He had played many parts, the dutiful son avenging Caesar, the defender of Rome against foreign threats, the reluctant ruler accepting power only to save the republic, the benevolent emperor ushering in an age of peace. Which of these parts was real? All of them. None of them. Augustus contained multitudes, as all complex humans do. But what matters is that he won, and in winning he changed everything. The next time you see a leader wrapping themselves in patriotic rhetoric while accumulating unprecedented power, remember Octavian. The next time you see propaganda painting complex political opponents as simple villains, remember how Antony and Cleopatra were portrayed. The next time you wonder whether love and power can coexist, remember two people who bet everything on that possibility and lost. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The specific circumstances of Actium will never recur. We don't fight naval battles with quinqueremes anymore, and Egypt isn't ruled by Ptolemaic pharaohs. But the underlying dynamics, the human elements of ambition and fear, love and calculation, propaganda and truth, these are eternal. The Republic died at Actium. Long live the Empire. And in those words, in that transformation, lies a warning that echoes through 20 centuries. Freedom, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. The Romans told themselves they still had their republic as Augustus accumulated powers that would have horrified their ancestors. They believed the lie because it was comfortable, because stability seemed preferable to chaos, because one man's rule seemed better than civil war. Maybe they were right. The Pax Romana that Augustus established brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to the Mediterranean world, but it came at the cost of liberty, of the messy, chaotic, beautiful experiment in shared governance that the Republic had represented. Was it worth it? That's the question Actium poses to us across the centuries. Is security worth freedom? Is peace worth power? Is stability worth self-governance? There are no easy answers, which is precisely why the battle still matters. The Actium waters are calm now, but the questions they witnessed remain turbulent, urgent, and unresolved. Every generation must answer them anew, and the answers we choose shape the world we leave behind. In the end, that's what makes Actium more than just another ancient battle. It's the moment when one vision of human society, messy, argumentative, republican, gave way to another, ordered, hierarchical, imperial. We've been living with the consequences ever since, in the DNA of every Western government, in the architecture of every capital city, in the very words we use to discuss power and politics. The sun set blood red over the Ionian Sea on September 2nd, 31 years before Christ. When it rose again, the world had changed. The Republic was dead, the Empire had begun, and we're still trying to understand what we lost and gained in those dark waters.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.